There's a secret reason why I always insisted that David Bromwich call me Clough Schwartz instead of Cliff Schwartz. After I step down, I'll allow each of you or any of you, and I'll tell you to ask me, and I'll tell you that secret reason. I want to share with you how I met David Bromwich and what he meant to me in my life and how he changed my life at a point in my life when I needed it. 1971, in September, I showed up as a 17-and-a-half-year-old high school graduate as a freshman. And I had an agenda. And when I met David Bromwich, he was my agenda all rolled up into one. First of all, I wanted to be a poet. I wasn't going to study poetry. I was going to study liberal studies, the Hutchins School of Liberal Studies, which was interdisciplinary. Their faculty came from every discipline. So I was going to take 4 years, and I was going to study everything there was in civilization, interdisciplinary, cut out the chaff, and put the good stuff in my poetry for the rest of my life. Also, I was going to get revenge on Mr. Mingo. Mr. Mingo was the creative writing teacher in my high school in Los Angeles who did not choose me to be the editor of the high school poetry magazine. I was going to show Mr. Mingo I was going to edit a college poetry magazine. Not only that, I was headed north. I hated Los Angeles, and I was going to make it north for 4 years in Northern California, and I was going to keep on going north through Seattle, back to Canada, and I was going to learn Western Canada, and I was going to make it real, all those little points of interest on the big pink map that was on the board in my Canadian childhood where I went to elementary school. I was finally going to go back to Toronto and live there, and eventually wind up in England where I could find my relatives. And in my high school in Los Angeles in 1970, there was an underground publication, which I remember sitting on the grass. One of us had a copy of it, and I was reading over someone's shoulder. The underground publication was called The Underground Guide to Colleges, which said that California had 2 colleges where the professors were already hippies before we get there. The first was Santa Cruz, and the other was Sonoma State. So I was accepted at Sonoma State in September of 1971. I was in the Hutchins School of Liberal Studies, and they told me there is no poetry magazine of student poetry for you to edit. You're going to have to start one. How do I do that? Go to the English department and get a sponsor. So I remember showing up, and I remember talking to Professor Eugene Soulez, who happened to be there, I guess, and he said, you have to talk to David Bromwich. So when I met David Bromwich, he was a poet, he was from England, he lived in Canada, and he was a hippie. In September and October of 1971, David was my faculty sponsor. The first thing he did was take me into the English department, introduced me to the women who ran the office. Then he showed me the mimeograph machine, and you remember him saying, you'll have to know how to run a mimeograph machine if you'll publish a poetry magazine. So he taught me to do that. He taught me how to work with the people in the office so I could use the mimeograph machine when they weren't using it. And then he said, you're going to have a mailbox. So he set up a mailbox in the English department for the poems to arrive in. And then he said, you're going to have an office. So his office, which he shared with Professor Helen Dunn, was also my office. And in those months, September, October, November, December 1971, and all into the next year, I had my dream. I was publishing a poetry magazine in his office. And I would collect the poems. I organized an editorial staff. Some people are here. I remember Stella helped me, and Tom Sharp helped me, and a lot of others. and we hashed out which poems were going to be in the magazine. And when we were done, I had to go and type them onto the stencils for the mimeograph machine. I ran them off, I stapled them, and then for a month, I would follow the young student who sold baklava out of a basket, the young hippie student, and he sold his baklava for 50 cents, and I'd follow him with a basket of poetry, and I'd say, "You want to buy poetry for 5 cents?" And that's how I published the poetry magazine, which we decided, and I guess this is Bromwicheism, not to give it a name. We simply called it by the name of the month. So in November it was called November, in December it was called December, and on through the first the spring semester of 1972. But more than that, David Bromwich took me home. His wife Cheryl at the time had their home open, open to students. And I would show up there with my guitar that was always out of tune, but I played it anyway. And he had a piano that always seemed to be out of tune, but he played it anyway. And we played this music book that he and his buddies wrote called Living in Advance. High on the hill on 1st Street, 880 1st Street in Sebastopol. We made noise. We didn't really make music. I knew it was bad, but we made life. So he became, after I left Sonoma State, he became a lifelong friend. And, you know, David, I tell you, I have taught 17-year-olds. And what he created for me was a hell of a good thing to give to a 17-year-old. Boy, you know, that was wonderful for me. And more than actually teaching me academically, David Bromwich gave me a vision of what an educated person might do with his life. And that's really what I try to be for my students, in addition to getting them their grades so they can transfer on to a four-year college.